What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Corporate Bartender. Today's episode is a good one. We've got Dr. Cory Rosen on the program. If you don't know Cory, get ready because this conversation is stretching into new territory. Cory's an author, speaker, and the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership. He's one of the world's leading experts on employee ownership, and we're going to talk about what that could mean for you and your organizations. He's a great person. This conversation was super informative, and I think you're going to dig it. So buckle up, TCBers, grab your favorite cocktail, and let's get right on into it with Dr. Cory Rosen on today's TCB.
Welcome to SkyTeam's The Corporate Bartender, where we gather some of the best HR and people leaders to discuss what's happening on the people side of business. Now pull up a stool, belly up to the bar, and join us for The Corporate Bartender.
Well, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday. It's your favorite day and mine. It's Corporate Bartender Day. It is the 18th of January, 2023. This is the 156th time that we've gotten together. And today's going to be a good one. We've got a guest. You'll see the stranger up in your Brady Bunch view. This is Dr. Cory Rosen. He's the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership. And he just wrote a book called Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. And that sounds like a pretty tall order to me. But we've been talking about it as we teased his appearance over the last couple of weeks. It's an interesting conversation to be had about employee ownership. I've worked for organizations in which I've owned a stake in the past and started my own businesses. And it's a game changer as it relates to employees and employee commitment and motivations and who gets a piece of the pie, if that pie is a good one. In the pre-show, Cory and I were talking about startups, and I've been a member of a few. And we talked about, how startups tend to go one of two ways. Either you buy a boat and a private island and live out the rest of your life happy and carefree, or you lay everybody off and do it again with less money in your bank account than you started. So it's an interesting prospect here. The big idea is just thinking about, we've got an engagement issue with folks. We're dealing with things like quiet quitting and the great resignation. People are insecure about their wealth. Cory talks a lot about social distrust and how that factors into this. Today's employees they're struggling with this engagement notion, with capitalism in general. And, we've talked about it from a DE&I perspective here, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And that's been sort of under the microscope over the last couple of years. So let's welcome Dr. Cory Rosen to the program. Everybody dances in, Cory. That's how we do it. Before we get into the interview, I want to, just for the folks who are not here today, but who will see this on video, you guys know I'm going to keep asking because I'm a pain in the ass. Buy the book. If you haven't bought the book, we were talking about it in the pre-show. Chuck and Laurel actually like it. So, I'm going to call that a win. It's a big win that we don't often get. Feedback on the book is good. We've gotten some notices over the last couple of days. We got an email today from a client we haven't seen in a while that bought the book, and it's nice. It's nice to get those messages when people read the book and they find utility in it. They find things that they can use to help make their lives better, and that's really what it's all about. We've got some guests upcoming. We're going to have next week on the program John Robertson, author of Run Toward the Roar, Transform Crisis and Change into the Opportunity to Thrive. He is a workforce wellness and cultural alignment specialist. And along with what we were talking about yesterday about culture work and what the hell is that anyway, we're gonna hit John with some of the tough questions about culture work in general. That's next week. This week, you see him here, Dr. Cory Rosen. So, Cory, there's Lori. I'm going to let her in. Then I don't have to watch the door anymore. She can co-host. So Cory, welcome. Welcome to the show. Thanks for hanging out with us today. As I mentioned in the open, Cory's the founder of the National Center of Employee Ownership and the author of this book here, Ownership: Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. Cory, before we get into this book and these concepts, I imagine that when you were but a child, you didn't imagine that this was where you would be today, the expert in employee ownership. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you find yourself here with us today.
I started as a political science professor in 1975, and I did that for a couple of years, decided that that was a game I'd rather play than watch. And I got a fellowship from the American Political Science Association to work on Capitol Hill. I went there in 1976 and ended up eventually working for the Senate Small Business Committee. And at that point, I read about this idea of employee ownership. Employee ownership, what's that?
Yeah, what is that?
I will explain. And I thought that's a really fascinating idea. And I want to get more involved in this. And so I did get more involved. I went to my boss. My boss was fortunately okay with my working on it. Ended up drafting some legislation that's now law on this. And after a few years doing that, decided this was an idea that more people would be interested in if they knew how to do it. They knew where they could find the resources to do it. They knew what the different ways to do it were. And we needed to find out, does this really work or not? Is this something we should be promoting, or is this just a bad idea and I should go do something else? And if it does work, what makes it work well and what makes it work poorly? So went down to my basement, said, this is the National Center for Employee Ownership, and hoped for the best. It took 3 years for me to pay myself. But today we have 19 staff people around the country. We're fully virtual, about 2,700 members. We're expecting about 2,000 people to our annual conference in Kansas City, in Chicago. So fortunately, the organization has grown and thrived. It is entirely supported by the work we do, not by grants, foundations, that sort of thing. And we're a membership organization. We have about 2,700 members. And if you're interested in finding out about that, go to our website at the National Center for Employee Ownership, and you can see what we do. Lots of books, lots of webinars, lots of everything on every kind of information on this.
That's awesome. What's the hook for NCEO? Why do companies join your organization?
Well, companies join either because they already have a plan and they want to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing, not just legally, but financially, culturally. We spend a lot of time on the culture issues of employee ownership, which I can very quickly sum up in one line, which is the first line of another book I wrote called Beyond Engagement. And that line says, it's simple. The best companies are the ones that generate the most ideas from the most people about the most things. And the question is, how do you make that happen? Because simply allowing or even encouraging employees to do it with open door management, every company in the world has open door management. There's no such thing as a closed door policy. Even encouraging it, much less just permitting it, doesn't get you there. You need structures of employee involvement. So we talk a lot about that. So companies join for those reasons. They join to network. And then a whole other group of companies join because they're trying to figure out, should we do this at all? And if we do it, do we do an ESOP? Do we do equity grants? What's the best way to do this? What are the tax issues? What are the rules? That sort of thing.
Awesome. I love it. I thought this would be an interesting topic for our listeners because, like I said in pre-show, most of us work in or around HR. And this is the conversation that I think a lot of HR people think about, but we don't necessarily know how to bring it up or where to take the conversation from the initial, hey, have we thought about doing any sort of employee ownership plan here? In your book, you argue that ownership is broken. And I was kind of looking to tie those two things together. What do you mean by that? Ownership is broken, and how do we as HR people help to fix that?
Yeah. So what we argue in the book is that there are a few different common ways to own businesses in the US right now. Of course, there's public companies. There are only about 4,500, but they employ 40-some% of the workforce. And of course, they're a major part of the economy. And what do we mean by ownership in a public company? If you go buy stock in Alphabet, are you an owner of Alphabet? And we argue really what you are is more akin to someone betting on a horse at the racetrack.
Right.
You're hoping that the stock will go up and you'll sell it if it does. But you're not an owner in the sense that you're investing your money in Alphabet. In fact, Alphabet and virtually every other public company doesn't use much of that money for growth. Very little of corporate growth is financed by the stock market, 5% maybe. The rest is retained earnings and debt. After all, equity is an expensive way to raise capital. Then you've got institutional owners. And these institutional owners are even less owners than you are, because you might hold on to your stock for months or years. Most institutional owners trade their stock with algorithms, and that stock is maybe held for microseconds, literally. So if I'm the CEO of a company, a public company, my typical tenure is 5 years. That's the median tenure of a CEO of a public company. And the pressure on me is quarter to quarter or less earnings. So one thing that's wrong with that system is it focuses on a short-term issue. And secondly, the wealth ownership of those companies is extraordinarily concentrated. Second form of ownership is private equity, which is even more concentrated. Now, they have a little bit different time horizon. They look to buy and sell companies within 3 to 7 years. So a little longer, but not much. So those two systems constitute over half of the asset ownership in the US. And neither of them is focused on the long term, number one, and neither of them provides ownership beyond, for the most part, the top 1% of the population or less.
So it's a game we can't even get in on.
Yeah. So why is this a problem aside from that long-term focus? Well, in the early 1970s, until the 1970s, when capital investment grew, wages grew. That had been the case in free market economies ever since there were free market economies. That relationship got broken. A lot of reasons: globalization, the pace of capital investment change, technological change, so that from 1973 till today, real wages have actually slightly declined. But real wealth attributable to ownership has grown at 8% per year since 1973. The Dow had 3 digits in 1973, and now it has 5. Ownership has continued to concentrate more and more and more. Three families own more wealth than 40% of the rest of the population.
Wow. I'm going to take a wild guess here. I'm assuming one of those families is a name ending in Walton.
Walton, yeah, that's one of them. So if you look at what the problems of that are, the people who are earning a living are finding it harder and harder to keep up. Because while their real wages haven't gone up, some of the real core costs to them have gone up. We've seen, of course, dramatic increases in healthcare costs and education particularly. And so people, 50% of the population, in fact, can't put its hands on $1,000 in emergency. Most of the population doesn't have enough money, in all likelihood, to retire very securely. Sending your kids to college has become an enormous problem, enormous debt now associated with that, and tremendous insecurity that comes from this feeling of not having much wealth. So the question is, well, if that's a problem, how do you fix it? And of course, you fix it by getting more wealth to people. Well, the traditional left-wing solution is, well, you tax people and you distribute that to everybody else. Whatever you think of the virtues of that, it's not politically very practical, because you're never going to be able to tax people enough and get enough political support for doing it. So it's kind of a political dead end. The conservative approach is, well, let's just get rid of regulations and reduce taxes. And we've tried that one too. And that hasn't worked out very well, at least not in terms of generating more wealth for people. More wealth for the economy,
sure, but
not a wealth that's distributed very well. So how do you make people owners? Well, they can't go buy stock. They don't have the money. So Louis Kelso, who invented the concept of employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, he said, well, you know, when somebody buys a company, they usually borrow money. They buy the company and they pay it back out of the future earnings that company generates. And why would you buy a company if you didn't think that was going to happen? You're making a pretty dumb investment. He said, well, what if the employees wanted to do that? Well, they couldn't, because they couldn't get the loan because they don't have collateral. So to solve that problem, oops, somehow my camera went off. Sorry.
No worries.
I don't know why that happened. All on its own. To solve that problem, Kelso said, companies could agree to provide the collateral. Company would borrow the money. It would purchase its shares and pay for them out of the future tax-deductible earnings of the company. We will encourage companies to do this through a variety of tax incentives that have accumulated, as it turns out, between 1974 and 1997. So the question becomes, well, did it pass my two tests? One is, does it work? Does it actually solve the problem it's intended to solve? And secondly, is it politically practical? Is it something that isn't just some nostrum? You know, most of the time you read books about how to change the economy, they're the "if I ruled the world" version. And of course, the authors don't rule the world, and they come up with perfect solutions that are politically impractical. And there's usually a paragraph at the end saying, this is probably not doable now, but we need to start with big ideas to try to help people move in this direction. And that never happens, almost never. So politically practical, you bet it is. Every single bill on employee ownership, and there's 17 of them, has passed unanimously.
Interesting.
There are now state legislation. There's state legislation on employee ownership. Same thing. They all pass without opposition.
Interesting.
Recently, Tommy Tuberville and Elizabeth Warren were on the same
I can't imagine agreeing on anything.
Right. They agreed on an employee ownership provision in the Defense Act. Ronald Reagan, Ted Kennedy, so it has this universal political support. That in itself should make us pay attention. But it does work. The main form of employee ownership, not the only form, but the main form, are ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, which I can explain. It's a very particular way to do this and very tax advantage. And the participants in these plans have 3 times the retirement assets. The companies grow 2.5% per year faster. They lay people off at 1/3 to 1/5 the rate of other companies, and their retention, this is something that HR people should sit up and notice, their retention rate is 70% better.
70%.
70.
Holy moly.
So, yeah, it's working. Now, of course, there are examples where it doesn't work,
Sure.
where companies fail. But for the most part, these companies have been extraordinarily successful. And just one last piece of data. The default rate on loans used for companies to fund ESOPs is 2 per 1,000 per year. So it's really worked. And there's about 14 million participants. Excuse me?
It passes both of your tests.
Passes both the tests with flying colors. And so my frustration, John Case and me, my co-author's frustration is, hey, here's a big problem everybody's talking about. Here's a solution that's politically feasible and it actually works.
Why aren't people doing it?
Why aren't people talking? Why aren't even people talking about it?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So if somebody was a benefactor of listening to this conversation and they go, oh, I'm a head of HR, I'm going to go talk to my CEO about this. How do you broker that conversation? What if I'm going to go in there and put this on the table? What do I lead with, Cory?
Yeah. Well, first of all, tell me in your audience, how many of you could just raise your hand or your virtual hand with a little chat, the little symbol there and the reactions. How many of you work for closely held companies?
I work for Morag Barrett. She holds it all.
Okay.
It's very close.
And how about public companies? So some of you don't work for companies, one for public companies. What?
Lori works for a nonprofit.
Not for profit.
A nonprofit. Okay.
And Chuck's a lawyer. He works for the devil.
All right. So nonprofits, it's trickier because there's nothing to own.
Yeah. Yeah, that's never been on. I've only worked for nonprofits my entire career. So I'm totally out in left field when it comes to these.
So it really depends on who you're talking to. If it's a closely held company, this notion of the employee stock ownership plan is really appealing potentially. If it's a closely held company with at least 20 employees and it's profitable, and you have owners who are thinking, one day I'm going to want to move on, maybe one day soon even. Or maybe there's multiple owners and one of us wants to move on, the rest of us would like to stick around. How do I do that? Well, I could sell to a consolidator, I could sell to a competitor, I could sell to private equity. But there are downsides to those. They typically come with contingencies. And it often means that at least some of the people who work for me won't keep their jobs, maybe a lot.
Right.
Maybe the company will move. Maybe the values that we've embedded in the company will change. You'll be promised that none of that will happen, by the way.
In every M&A.
In every case, you're absolutely every case. But that's typically, and sometimes that's true, but too often it's not true. So how would an ESOP help? Well, under the law, what happens is the company sets up a trust, the same kind of trust that other retirement plans like 401k plans use. But this trust, unlike those plans, is funded by the company out of its future tax-deductible profits. So essentially what's happening is the company is redeeming the shares of the owner. Normally, when you do a redemption, it is not a tax deduction. So, and that's another way that owners get out, is they just redeem the stock. But let's say I have a $3 million company. I'll need about $4.5 million in profits to have $3 million left over to buy my $3 million worth of stock. But with an ESOP, you only need $3 million because it's all pre-tax money. So that's a big deal. Secondly, if I do this following certain rules that aren't difficult to meet, then I can take the gain that I've made, reinvest it in stocks and bonds of U.S. companies, and defer any tax on the gain until I sell those new investments. You can't do that legally any other way. And third, if after we've done all this, we either are or convert to an S corporation and we're 100% owned by an ESOP, we don't pay any taxes. And that's not a loophole. That's the law.
That's the law. Yeah.
The employees, everybody who's worked there for 1,000 hours in a year, becomes a participant in the plan. They get allocations of stock as the company acquires the shares. And those allocations are subject to vesting. And when they leave the company buys the shares back from them. So you can finance these plans by borrowing money from a bank. You can use seller notes, or you can just make periodic contributions to the plan to fund the plan and buy the shares gradually. So that's what you do if you wanted to buy the owner out. Well, maybe you don't want to buy the owner out. They're not ready. Maybe it's a startup or a smaller company.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're looking more at, sort of thing you had, Eric, where the company gives you restricted stock, which basically says, here's some shares, but you don't get them until X happens, like you've worked here for a certain number of years, or stock appreciation rights or stock options. Or we often find, and I often recommend to companies, that they use synthetic equity, which says you're not going to get the actual shares, you're going to get the equivalent value of the shares or the value of the increase in the shares. The advantage of having literal shares is that for some people, and I underline some because it's a minority, for some people there are potential tax benefits if they're actual shares, in that you may be able to get capital gains treatment on what happens when you sell them. Most people, it won't matter, either because they don't make enough money or they don't meet the rules that you're required to meet to get that capital gains treatment. And so what happens is I exercise my restricted stock grant or stock appreciation right or whatever, and I get a check for that. So I don't, my ownership is really ephemeral. So why bother with the ownership at all? Just, give me the equivalent value. And that's what synthetic equity does. And it's often, and especially if you're an LLC, it can avoid some unpleasant traps that your employees can fall into when they're considered owners, not employees, and then they have to pay all their own Social Security and Medicare tax, and they don't qualify for health care and other things like that. So, for many people, that's a better way to do it. If you're a public company, it's more difficult if you're at HR, because you got to get to the decision maker and say, hey, we should share ownership with the employees. But if you can get in on that conversation, there are, as I've said, a lot of data indicating that companies do well on all the various dimensions of doing well.
I love that that there's the resource, there's a place, the NCEO, where we can get some of this data to have these conversations. I'm thinking about it from the employee side. We hear a lot of words like this, and depending on the industry and what the organization is trying to do, not everybody is super financially savvy, and we hear things like ESOP and stock options and RSUs and OSOs. And, we worked, I've worked in a lot of startups, and we work with startups. And if from an employee perspective, Cory, could you just break down what the difference is between an ESOP and getting stock options as part of a signing bonus or a part of a comp scheme in a startup?
Well, you wouldn't see very many ESOPs in startups because there are substantial costs to setting the plan up. So they'd be really rare for that to happen. So you're going to get.
Where would that happen in the life cycle of the organization? Like, the startup has been around for X number of years and has Y number of employees. When does that make sense?
20 employees and profitable.
Okay.
And then you're probably a candidate for doing an ESOP.
Okay.
And from the employee standpoint, if you get equity grants, they tend to be they vest over maybe 3 years or so, and then you have the right to exercise them after the point where they're vested or a few years after that, depending on how it's structured. And in almost all these cases, the way that they're going to have any value is that somebody buys your company.
Mm-hmm.
So some private companies will buy the shares back, but most of the time you're waiting for somebody to buy you. And of course, some people are waiting to go public, which happens very, 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 very rarely, but people think will happen much more often than it does. If it's an ESOP, it's more like the way retirement plans work. You will accumulate shares every year you work for the company until you leave the company.
So it's just a factor of the passage of time.
Yeah, every year more shares will be allocated to you in an ESOP. So, a typical ESOP participant in a closely held company over 20 years will get 4 to 6 times salary in a distribution from the ESOP.
That's a pretty powerful rule of thumb.
It's a big number. Yeah, the mean account balance is $134,000, but that includes people who've worked for 30 years and people who've worked for 3 months.
Right. So if we're going to embark upon this journey and do this ESOP, how hard is it to start? I mean, it sounds like any other governmental program. I was the administrator of several 401k programs, and that was a big pain in the ass. How hard is this to make happen, Cory?
Well, ESOPs are subject to a lot of rules in return for all those tax benefits. And so you're going to need a lawyer and a trustee and an appraiser and a plan administrator. And the initial costs of these can be anywhere from $100,000 to several $100,000 to set them up. The tax benefits will more than pay for that, but that's why you don't see them in startups. They're just too expensive. If you're doing an equity compensation grant program, you'll still need a lawyer, and your accountant's going to have to deal with it. You may need an appraisal done annually, and you probably want some kind of advisor to help you figure out how to do it. But there you might be looking at $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in the initial costs of setting the plan up, getting the grant agreements written, and all that sort of thing.
So if we're a company and we're thinking about this concept of employee ownership, and we like, that's a good idea, the stats look really good, but I don't know where to start. Where do people go to start? Can they go to the National Center for Employee Ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have on our website a lot of basic articles that explain how these things work. There's research data. And then if after you've looked at those basic articles, say, well, that's something I want to explore more. We have, I think it's 38 different titles that we write mostly on different aspects of employee ownership. So there's books. If I'm thinking about an ESOP, I'm an LLC and I want to give equity grants. I'm not an LLC, but I want to give equity grants. So there are books that go through the accounting and the tax law and how you decide who gets what and under what rules. And that's just kind of walks you through how to do this.
Do you also connect people with resources, attorneys, accountants?
We have a service provider directory.
Excellent.
We don't set up these plans.
Right on. I think this is the conversation underserved. What do we need to do to help evangelize this and make this idea more common?
Tell other people. That's
well, it's interesting because I think it's so daunting. Like we talked in the pre-show, not a lot of people side of the business people have deep financial acumen. We don't typically come out of finance programs in school, and we connect with the social fabric ideas of programs like this, but they seem very complicated and daunting, and it feels out of our lane, I think, sometimes. Yeah. What advice would you give to folks who are interested in the concepts but feel a little overwhelmed by, you said a lot of words today that some people are going to go, I don't even know what those words are, right? So what advice would you give those folks?
Yeah, don't try to get too much into the weeds about this is how it works. Think more about the concept of what would happen if you shared ownership with employees. A lot of companies talk about, we want to make our employees feel like owners. And I see these articles saying, give people a psychological sense of ownership. That's what really matters. And I want to take those people to dinner. In fact, since some of you are in the Denver area, I'll take them to Edible Beats. They've got a bunch of restaurants. I'll take them to Edible Beats. You'll see why in a moment. And I'll let them soak up the atmosphere, read the menu, help make decisions, help clean up afterwards. But they can't eat because a sense of dinner should be sufficient, just like a sense of ownership is sufficient. And I would take them to Edible Beats. I guess there's 5 restaurants they own, because Edible Beats is 100% owned by its employees. Mm-hmm. And that's a good way to talk to people about this. And if you go to our website, well, you can just look this up on Google. The Employee Ownership 100 is the largest 100 employee-owned companies that are majority employee-owned. And you'll see some recognizable names. But talk about what's the reason to do this, that if employees really are owners, it gets them more connected to the company. It gives them more of a reason to stay. It's a good way to attract people. And there are a variety of ways to do it. And you don't need to worry so much about, well, explain to me those 4 ways. And if you're interested in this, go to this website and you can see the different ways to do it.
Awesome.
Excellent. Yep. Somebody's an Edible Beats fan.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I know they own Root Down and Linger. I forgot they owned L5, Chuck. That place is awesome. That place
great
is
restaurant.
Awesome. Yeah.
Justin Cucci is a great guy and very much an advocate for what Cory's talking about.
That's awesome. Chuck, from the legal side, have you come across, in all of your employee dealings, any of these ownership issues gone bad?
I haven't. It's out of my lane, though. I don't do any work. It's tax heavy. It's not really an area in which I practice. And so I really appreciate the information from Dr. Rosen. Haven't seen it go bad, that's for sure, in my 30 years of practicing law, but I don't work on the benefits side of the house in this regard.
Awesome. Ruby, you had a question you dropped into chat before Chuck took over with his Edible Beats breakdown.
I was just thinking about if Cory, you've seen any companies do a really good job of educating their employees on, financial literacy and what these programs mean for them and how it differentiates their company. Because a lot of people don't lean into this if they're not economists. So I was trying to use the right word. So just wondering if you've seen any companies do a really good job of that, and what does it look like? Because those programs are only as good as people understand the benefits.
Well, the employee ownership companies are very big on this issue. Most of them
speaking it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most of them share income statements, balance sheets, and lots of metrics with employees. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to them to get people to understand it. And there's a perception that, employees will never understand this stuff. You can find a lot of males anyway who can give you very detailed explanations of sports statistics. Economic numbers in companies are no more complicated. In fact, they're often less complicated. So it's really patronizing to say that.
Yes, it is.
The company that, thank you, the company that pioneered this, and they have a website, The Great Game of Business. There's a best-selling book, The Great Game of Business. There are 100, the company that started it, it's now called SRC Holdings, 100% ESOP-owned company. The employees bought it in 1983 from what was then International Harvester. It was failing. So it was International Harvester. They had 119 employees. And Jack Stack, who was then and still is amazingly the CEO, said, we can't afford to lose any money. And so I'm going to teach every employee how to read a balance sheet and an income statement and how we make money in our business. And these are guys who operate machines, typically with high school education. And the result of that was that people started talking about the numbers in the company. I went there once in the late 80s. I asked this guy in a machine, what do you think the biggest problem of SRC right now is? He says, we have to improve our current ratio. I had to go look up what a current ratio was. Jack had a janitor who said to him once, Jack, you keep talking about recession. I think there is a recession coming. And we remanufacture heavy duty truck engines. Recession's not going to be good for that. But what happens in a recession? People fix their cars more. We should get into rebuilding car engines. This is the janitor.
Wow.
Jack says, that's an interesting idea, because he's the kind of guy who would do that, goes to his management team, and they decide to do it. So what the Great Game of Business, and they've developed a lot of materials around this. So if you want to learn how to do this, they are the best. They have really good stuff on it.
Laurel, it sounds like you're familiar with that. You chipped in there a couple times. Did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was going to write it in the chat right before you moved over into the conversation. When I was doing medical device manufacturing the last time around, so we sold that company, a dozen years ago now. That was the book we used. That was our Bible.
All right.
And I actually led several of the finance classes to teach people how to read this. So you got an HR person who's able to talk people through the financials, and one who I count on my fingers. So that's why I liked your comment, Cory, that trying to say that people can't understand this is, it's condescending, at least mansplaining at worst. And our whole plant understood, they understood EBITDA, which again was one of those you have to go, oh, what does all that mean?
Right.
But more than that, they knew how what they were doing every day, not only, they knew two things: how it made us money and how it saved the lives of newborn infants.
Wow. Great story.
Yeah. So
love that.
Yeah, I'm a believer.
It's funny you're talking about the condescension thing, and it made me think about, since sports betting has become legal, like now when you watch a game, like the pregame or the breakdown, there's all of these betting statistics that they assume everybody knows what it means. I have no idea what it means. And I see these things and I'm like, am I supposed to care about that? Is that something that I'm supposed to be interested in? But I just find it fascinating, just based on the comment that you guys all just made here, that in that sports world, because Cory drew our attention to the fact that, a lot of dudes know a lot of things about sports statistics, the assumption is made in the, we're going to put this on TV space. Everybody will get this complicated world of odds and betting. And to Cory's point, not all that dissimilar from financial statistics, right? And in that space, we make the assumption that people won't get it. It's too complicated. So I love that. And I love this resource. Thank you, Cory. Any other questions for Cory?
I think in February, you need to teach us all how to parlay our bets.
Maybe we could get Cory to come on and do that, because I'm sure he gets it. He's got that all figured out, I'm sure.
I don't have a clue about any of that stuff. So
Awesome. Any other questions as we're coming up here in our last 5 minutes and we need to get into our funny things, our good feels, and our cocktails, and then get off to dinner? Going once, twice. All right. Well, Cory, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks to all of you.
Awesome. It was a good conversation. You know, it's interesting, right? Getting into conversations that get out there on the edge of technicality. I think, man, HR people need to know these things, and they need to be reasonably conversant in talking about these things. And you know, I like to get out there and get into things that are outside of our HR comfort zone. So thanks, Cory, for being here.
Thank you
for sharing your insights. NCEO.org is the place to go. That is the National Center for Employee Ownership. It will give you information about all the things we talked about today. You can also find Cory's book, Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What, at those fine booksellers everywhere. Awesome. So funny things today. Cory, you're welcome to hang out, or you may do what you need to do. Funny thing number one today. Everyone. Yeah, thank you, Cory. Funny thing number one today for me, this made me laugh. Texted, "I love you" to my mom, and she said, "We'll see." Whoops. Number two, being an auntie is so fun. I just make shit up. I told my niece I have T-Mobile, and T-Mobile don't get the right satellites to play JoJo Siwa's music. JoJo Siwa is an artist that tweens are into. And if you don't want to listen to tween music, you tell her that your cellular provider does not provide access to such things. Funny thing number three, this is a holidays one. Which wine pairs best with finding out my in-laws are staying a day longer than I thought?
All the wine.
All conveniently in one glass.
Cat ownership is hearing a single soft clink from across the house and yelling, "Get away from the butter!"
Yep.
In our case, it's the side of the couch. I can hear the claw hit the side of the couch. And I yell, Cory. My whole life is a lie. Those guards at Buckingham Palace, you never knew. Coneheads, all of them.
Oh, man.
And my favorite funny thing today is from Mark Hamill. Mark Hamill is just wicked on Twitter. He is worth looking at Twitter. Keep one thing from this room, and it's a picture of George Lucas in a room with Star Wars artifacts. And Mark Hamill's comment is George's wallet.
Exactly.
Oh, today's good feel story is all about kids and the power that they bring.
There are few things in this world more powerful than a child with a dream. And in this week's On the Road, CBS's Steve Hartman shows us how a group of Minnesota school kids used their dream to help their fellow classmates.
Dang.
It's why I still have faith in humanity.
That's right.
Love it.
Yeah.
Today's semi-quarantine cocktail is called 911 Moving and Storage. It's a riff on the robber cocktail. You're going to need a dash of bitters, two Florida people.
Oh, boy.
2 parts scotch, 1 robbery in progress. That was hard because robbery's hard. You're going to need a little sweet vermouth and a bright idea to call 911 to ask police to help them move and catch a ride to the airport because they're going to go to New York for the weekend after they robbed this house. You're going to need a maraschino cherry in there. This couple had burglarized a Family Dollar earlier in the day, and the officers did help them move and gave them a ride to the Polk County Pokey. So just when I have faith in humanity, kids that raise money for adaptive playgrounds, I read a story about a couple who are thieves who call the police to help them lift heavy stuff that they're stealing. Faith in humanity, gone. Gone. Guys, thank you today for being here. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for participating in a conversation that's out on the edge of what we do here. We're getting a little super financial, but I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you hanging in. I have the utmost gratitude for each and every one of you. We'll see you next week. We've got John Robertson here. Run toward the roar.
See you, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you had a good time and learned a thing or two at today's happy hour, please share it with your friends. If you want to join our tribe, head on over to skyeteam.cloud/TCB or email us at info@skyeteam.com. That's SKYE team.com. Thanks again, and remember, you've always got friends at the Corporate Bartender.